There are things you film in the dark that should never see daylight, and I've kept mine hidden for 23 years. My name is John Mercer, and I'm 55 years old now, but the man I was at 32 died in those woods the night I first heard it speak. I was a wildlife documentary filmmaker back then, the kind who'd spend months alone in the wilderness chasing shots that networks might use for 30 seconds of airtime. I told myself it was about the art, about capturing nature in its rawest form, but the truth I wouldn't admit was simpler and sadder. I preferred the company of trees to people, the silence of snowfall to conversation, the honesty of predators to the masks we all wear in civilization. Northern Minnesota in late October becomes a different world after sunset. The forests near the Canadian border stretch for hundreds of miles, dense with white pine and black spruce, broken only by frozen lakes that reflect the stars like shattered mirrors. I'd set up camp about 40 miles from the nearest logging road, in a region so remote that even experienced hunters avoided it. The locals in Grand Marais had warned me with that particular mixture of mockery and genuine concern that marks small-town wisdom. "Nothing good happens that far in," an old man at the gas station had said, his fingers wrapped around a coffee cup that never seemed to empty. "Things go in there and change. Or don't come back at all." I'd smiled and nodded the way you do when you think you're smarter than folk wisdom, when you believe your expensive camera equipment and satellite phone make you immune to whatever superstitions haunt rural America. The first 3 weeks passed like they always did. I filmed gray wolves at dawn, their breath visible in the freezing air as they move through clearings with that peculiar grace that makes you forget they're killers. I captured a bull moose stripping bark from a birch tree, the sound of it echoing through morning fog. My days fell into the rhythm that had sustained me through a decade of solitary expeditions. Wake before sunrise, coffee boiled over a camp stove, hours of hiking to predetermined locations, then the patient waiting that defines wildlife photography. Sunset brought me back to camp, where I'd review footage on my laptop, eat freeze-dried meals that all tasted vaguely the same, and fall asleep to the sound of wind in the pines. I was content in that loneliness. Maybe content isn't the right word. I was numb, and I'd mistaken numbness for peace. October 27th changed everything. I'd set up my night vision equipment near a game trail, hoping to film fishers or possibly a lynx. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees, and my breath crystallized in the air as I adjusted the infrared camera mounted on a tripod. It was just past midnight when I first felt it, that primitive awareness that you're being watched, the one that bypasses your rational mind and goes straight to the part of your brain that remembers when humans were prey. I'd felt it before in grizzly country in Alaska, but this was different. This felt personal, focused, and impossibly patient. I swept my flashlight across the tree line, seeing nothing but shadows and the green reflection of eyes that belonged to some small nocturnal creature, probably a fox or raccoon. But the feeling didn't pass. It intensified. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees in the span of minutes. My camera equipment, which had been functioning perfectly, began to malfunction. The digital display flickered, showing fragments of images that couldn't be real, shapes that were almost human but wrong in their proportions, standing in positions where nothing stood. I checked the connections, thinking it was the cold affecting the electronics, but my hands were shaking, and it wasn't just from the temperature. That's when I heard the first sound. It started as something that could have been wind through dead branches, but it shaped itself into something else, something that rose and fell with a rhythm that mimicked speech without quite being words. It came from approximately 50 yards into the forest, from a direction where my flashlight revealed nothing but darkness between the trees. I should have left. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up my equipment and hike back to camp, even in the dark, even with the risk of getting lost. But I was a filmmaker, and filmmakers are cursed with curiosity that overrides survival instinct. I switched on my handheld camera, the one with the powerful LED light attachment, and pointed it toward the source of the sound. What I saw in that circle of light froze me in place more effectively than the Minnesota cold ever could. There was a shape there, standing behind a cluster of pines about 40 yards away. At first, my brain tried to categorize it as a standing bear, then as a very tall person in dark clothing, then as nothing at all, just shadows playing tricks. But it moved, and the movement was wrong. Too fluid for its size, too deliberate for an animal, too aware for something that should have fled from my light. The sound came again, and this time I could hear the structure in it, Syllables that shouldn't exist coming from something that shouldn't speak. It said my name. Not John, but Mercer, drawn out in a voice that sounded like it was coming from somewhere deep underwater or from the other end of a very long tunnel. I remember my finger was on the record button, and I remember pressing it, and I remember the red light indicating that I was capturing this moment, but I don't remember deciding to do it. Some part of me, the professional part that had been trained to document everything, had taken over while the rest of me was trying to understand what was happening. The shape moved closer, stepping fully into my light for just a moment, and I saw it clearly enough to know that what I was looking at couldn't exist, shouldn't exist, and would haunt every moment of my life that came after. It was tall, impossibly tall, maybe 8 or 9 feet, with proportions that seemed to shift depending on how the light hit it. The body was gone to the point of starvation, covered in something that could have been matted fur or could have been skin pulled too tight over a frame of jutting bones. But it was the head that made my blood feel like it had turned to ice water in my veins. It was elongated, almost equine, but with a bone structure that suggested something that had once been human and had been stretched and reformed by forces that didn't care about the original design. And the eyes, I could see them even in the peripheral wash of my light, were too large, too reflective, too aware of exactly what they were looking at. It tilted its head in a gesture that was disturbingly curious, almost gentle, and then it spoke again. This time the words were clear, formed with care by something that had learned human speech but had no human mouth to speak it with. You've been here before, Mercer. You keep coming back. Why do you run from what you are? The voice was layered, as if multiple people were speaking in imperfect unison, each voice slightly delayed from the others. I stood there with my camera running, unable to move, unable to think beyond the simple fact that something impossible was talking to me in the dark forest, something that knew my name and seemed to know more about me than it should. It took a step closer, and I could hear the sound its feet made on the frozen ground. Not the soft pad of an animal's paw or the crack of a human step, but something in between, something that whispered against the earth like it was barely touching it. You document life, it said, and there was something in that voice that might have been amusement or might have been sadness. But you don't live. You watch. You record. You preserve moments you'll never be part of. I see you, John Mercer. I've always seen you. I finally found my voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. What are you? It was the only question I could form, the only thing that seemed to matter in that moment. The creature, and I had no other word for it, made a sound that could have been a laugh if laughs could carry the weight of centuries. I am what happens when hunger never ends, it said. When need becomes the only truth. When everything soft gets stripped away until only appetite remains. I am what you fear you'll become if you stay out here long enough, Mercer. I am the loneliness that eats everything else. And then it moved backward, not turning around but somehow retreating into the darkness between the trees, its eyes the last thing to disappear, holding my gaze until the forest swallowed it completely. I stood there with my camera still recording, the red light blinking in the darkness, and I didn't move for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. When I finally looked down at my camera's viewfinder, I could see the footage was there, dark and grainy but undeniably real. I had proof. I had documentation. And I knew with absolute certainty that I could never show it to anyone, because some truths are too dangerous to share, and some things, once acknowledged, can never be unknown. I didn't leave the woods that night, and I've spent 2 decades trying to understand why. The rational part of my mind was screaming at me to pack up everything, hike back to civilization in the dark if necessary, and never return to that godforsaken stretch of forest. But I didn't. Instead, I sat in my tent with my footage playing on repeat on my laptop, studying every frame, every shadow, every impossible angle of that creature's form. The sun came up on October 28th, and I was still there, still watching, still trying to reconcile what I'd seen with everything I thought I knew about the natural world. I'd filmed unknown species before, a subspecies of marten in British Columbia that biologists hadn't catalogued, a color variant of red fox in the Yukon that might have been a genetic anomaly. But this was different. This wasn't an undiscovered animal. This was something that stood at the edge of myth and reality, something that spoke in human language about human fears, something that knew my name and seemed to understand the emptiness I'd been carrying for years. I didn't see it again for 3 days, but I felt its presence constantly. Every time I left my tent, I could sense eyes on me from the tree line. Every night, I'd hear sounds in the distance. Sometimes that same layered voice speaking words I couldn't quite make out, sometimes just movements that were too large and too deliberate to be natural wildlife. My equipment continued to malfunction in strange ways. Cameras would turn on by themselves, recording hours of footage that showed nothing but darkness and occasional shapes that might have been trees moving in wind or might have been something else. My satellite phone, which had worked perfectly for weeks, couldn't maintain a signal. The battery in my main camera drained in hours instead of the usual 2 days. I should have been terrified, and part of me was, but a larger part was fascinated in a way I'd never been before. For the first time in my adult life, I felt truly present, truly awake, because I was in the presence of something that demanded my complete attention. On the 4th night, it came back. I was reviewing footage by lantern light when I heard its voice clearly from just outside my tent. "You stayed, Mercer. I wondered if you would." I remember my hand shaking as I reached for the zipper, and I remember thinking that opening that tent might be the last thing I ever did. But I opened it anyway, because by then I understood that this creature could have killed me at any point if that was its intention. It was standing about 15 feet away, just at the edge of my lantern's light, and in that warmer glow I could see details I'd missed in the LED glare of my camera light. The fur, or was it hair, that covered parts of its body was a mottled gray-brown, the color of dead vegetation and winter bark. Its hands, if they could be called hands, had fingers that were too long and tipped with what looked like bone that had grown through the skin and hardened into claws. But it was the face that held my attention. In that softer light, I could see the humanity buried in its features, the suggestion of what it might have been before hunger and isolation had transformed it into this thing of legend. "Why are you still here?" I asked, and my voice sounded steadier than I felt. It tilted its head again in that unsettling gesture of curiosity. "I could ask you the same question. Most men would have run. Most men do run when they see me. But you sat in your tent and watched your little screen, studying me like I'm one of your animals. You're not afraid enough, John Mercer. That makes you interesting or it makes you broken. I haven't decided which yet." It moved closer, each step careful and measured, until it was close enough that I could smell it. A smell of old fur and frozen earth and something sharp like the air before lightning strikes. "I've watched you for years," it said, and that revelation sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold. "Every time you come to these woods, I watch. You sit alone in your camp, you talk to no one, you touch nothing with affection. You're practicing for what I am, Mercer. You're teaching yourself to need nothing, to want nothing, to be nothing but appetite and observation." I wanted to argue to defend myself, but the words died in my throat because there was truth in what it said. I'd been alone for so long that I'd forgotten what connection felt like. My ex-wife had left me 6 years earlier, tired of being married to a man who was present only in body when he wasn't actively in the wilderness. I had colleagues but no friends, acquaintances but no intimacy. I'd convinced myself that my solitary expeditions were about art and science, but sitting there in the freezing October night with a creature of legend telling me truths about myself, I understood that I'd been running from something I couldn't name. "What do you want from me?" I asked finally. The creature made that sound again, the one that might have been laughter. "I want you to understand," it said. "Humans come into these woods and they tell stories about me. They say I'm a monster, a demon, a curse. They say I eat human flesh and steal souls. But they don't understand what I really am. I'm what happens when you're so hungry for connection that you'd consume anything to fill the void, when you're so alone that you'd rather become something terrible than remain something human and unloved. I'm the price of isolation, Mercer. I'm what waits at the end of the path you're walking." Over the next weeks, it came to my camp almost every night. Sometimes it spoke, sometimes it just stood at the edge of the light and watched me work. I continued filming, though I'd stopped pretending I was there for wolves or moose or any of the subjects I'd originally planned to document. I was there for it, for this impossible thing that had chosen to reveal itself to me. The conversations we had, and I hesitate to call them conversations, because they were more like confessions forced out of me by its relentless presence, stripped away every defense I'd built around my isolation. It told me about hunger that never ends, about remembering being human but no longer understanding what human meant, about watching people from the shadows for centuries and seeing the same patterns repeat. It told me that it had been a man once, long before the forests were mapped, a man who'd gotten lost in winter and made choices that couldn't be unmade, who'd eaten what shouldn't be eaten and become what shouldn't exist. I asked it once why it didn't just kill me, why it wasted time talking to someone who posed no threat to it. It was silent for a long time, so long that I thought it wouldn't answer. Then it said, "Because you listen, Mercer. Because you don't run and you don't scream and you don't try to explain me away. You just listen. Do you know how long it's been since anyone listened?" There was something in its voice then that sounded almost human, almost vulnerable, and I realized with a shock that shook me more than fear ever had that this creature was lonely. That for all its power and all its terror, it was fundamentally alone in a way that made my own isolation look like a choice I could walk away from. I spent November in those woods, long past when I should have returned to civilization. I told myself I was gathering unique footage, documenting something no one had ever documented before, but the truth was simpler and sadder. I stayed because for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. I stayed because something, even if that something was a monster from legend, knew me and spoke to me and saw me completely. I stayed because I was becoming what it had warned me about, and part of me didn't care. Winter came early that year, the first serious snow falling on November 15th, and with it came a change in the creature's behavior. It started appearing during daylight hours, standing at the edge of clearings where I was filming, no longer content to remain a creature of darkness and shadows. I'd see it between trees, watching me with those two large eyes, and I'd continue working as if this was normal, as if I hadn't crossed some fundamental line between documentarian and participant. My supplies were running low, and my satellite phone had stopped working entirely, but I didn't make any serious attempt to leave. I told myself I'd go after the next conversation, after one more night of footage, after I understood just a little bit more. But those were lies I told myself to avoid admitting the truth. I didn't want to leave because going back to civilization meant going back to being invisible, to being the person no one noticed or needed or knew. Here, in these frozen woods with a creature that shouldn't exist, I mattered. I was seen. The first week of December brought a blizzard that should have killed me. The temperature dropped to -15, and snow fell so heavily that I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond my tent. I'd run out of fuel for my camp stove 2 days earlier, and I was rationing my remaining food, knowing that I'd have to attempt the 40-mile hike back to civilization soon or risk not making it out at all. That's when it came to my tent in the middle of the storm, its voice cutting through the howl of wind. "You're dying, Mercer. Your lips are blue and your hands shake even when you try to hold them still. Why are you still here?" I was wrapped in every piece of clothing I'd brought, shivering so hard I could barely speak, but I managed to say, "Because if I leave, I'll go back to being no one. Here, at least someone knows I exist. Even if that someone is you." The silence that followed was profound, and then the creature did something I never expected. It came closer to my tent, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating from its body, which somehow seemed even colder than the winter air around us. "You think I give you purpose," it said, and for the first time its voice sounded truly sad, truly ancient. "You think being seen by a monster is better than being invisible to humans. That's how it starts, Mercer. That's how I became what I am. I stayed in the woods because people made me feel empty, and the emptiness consumed me until it was all I was. You're standing at the edge of the same transformation. I've been waiting to see if you'd step back or step forward." I looked at it through the frost forming on my eyelashes, this impossible thing that had dominated my thoughts for weeks, and I asked the question I'd been afraid to voice. "Do you want me to become like you? Is that what this has been about?" It made a sound that was definitely not laughter this time, a sound that carried weight and sorrow and something that might have been regret. "No, John Mercer. I don't want you to become like me. I've spent 300 years in these woods being exactly what I am, and every moment of those 300 years has been hunger and cold and isolation so complete that it feels like madness. I don't want company in this existence. I wanted you to understand what you were choosing before the choice became permanent. I wanted you to see where your path leads. Because if you stay much longer, if you let this isolation become your identity, You won't be able to go back. The world will forget you, and you'll forget how to be part of the world, and then you'll be something like me. Alive but not living, conscious but not human, aware of everything you've lost but unable to remember how to reclaim it. The wind screamed around us, and I realized I was crying, tears freezing on my face almost as soon as they fell. I don't know how to go back, I said. I don't know how to be around people anymore. I don't know how to matter to anyone. The creature was silent for a long moment, and then it said something that I've carried with me every day since. You matter because you're alive, not because someone sees you. You matter because you have the capacity to change, to choose to become different than what you are right now. I lost that capacity when I chose to survive at any cost, when I let hunger become my only truth. But you haven't lost it yet. You're still human, Mercer. You're still capable of walking away from this, from me, from the isolation you've built around yourself like a fortress. But you have to choose it. You have to want to be part of the world more than you want to hide from it. It stood up then, rising to its full terrible height, and stepped back from my tent. I'm going to tell you something I've never told another living person, it said. And then I'm going to leave, and you're never going to see me again. My name was Thomas. Thomas Whitfield. I had a wife named Sarah and 2 children I don't remember the names of anymore. I got lost in these woods in the winter of 1724, and I made choices that seemed like survival at the time but were really about giving up on ever finding my way back to them. I let the hunger win because it was easier than fighting to stay human when being human hurt so much. I've regretted it every single day since, but I can't undo what I am. You still can. Take your footage, go back to civilization, and show it to no one. What I am isn't meant to be shared. But take the understanding with you. Take the knowledge that isolation is a choice that becomes a trap, and the trap eventually becomes a transformation you can't reverse. The storm cleared the next morning, and I packed up my camp with shaking hands. The creature, Thomas, was gone, and I knew with certainty that I'd never see it again. I hiked out of those woods carrying 40 pounds of equipment and 23 days of footage that I've never shown to anyone. The drive back to Grand Marais felt like returning from another world, and in a way, I suppose it was. I've spent the last 23 years trying to honor what Thomas told me. I rejoined the world slowly, painfully, forcing myself to accept invitations, to have conversations, to let people see me even when every instinct screamed at me to retreat into isolation. I still make documentaries, but I'm not alone in the wilderness for months anymore. I have a small crew now, people I've learned to trust, people who've somehow become friends even though I'm terrible at friendship. I'm 55 years old now, and I still have nightmares about those weeks in the Minnesota woods. But they're not nightmares about a monster hunting me. They're dreams about a lonely thing that used to be human, warning another lonely thing about the price of giving up on humanity. I keep the footage on a hard drive in my office, encrypted and backed up, but I've never watched it since I left those woods. I don't need to. I remember every word, every moment, every truth that Thomas shared with me. Sometimes late at night, when I'm alone and the old urges to retreat from the world start creeping back, I think about him standing in eternal winter, conscious and aware and utterly alone, and I make myself reach out to someone, anyone, just to prove that I still can. I tell people I'm a wildlife filmmaker who specializes in remote locations, and that's true enough. But what I really am is someone who met a Wendigo in the deep woods and learned that the most terrifying thing in the forest isn't the monsters in the shadows. It's the possibility of becoming one yourself, one choice at a time, one retreat at a time, until you wake up one day and realize you've forgotten how to be anything else. Thomas saved my life by showing me what I was becoming, and I honor that gift by refusing to become it. That's the terrible thing he said to me in those woods, the truth I can never unhear. We all have the capacity to become monsters, but only if we choose isolation over connection, only if we let hunger become our only truth, only if we forget that being human means staying human even when it's painful. I'm still here. I'm still human. And every day I choose to remain that way is my way of remembering a creature named Thomas who gave up his humanity so I wouldn't have to give up mine.